I'm Matt Valley. Welcome to episode number 63 of the Rock and Roll Research Podcast, where we share the super cool backstories and side gigs. Yes, that's right. Of the research and insights pros that you trust. So today's guest is Mireya Arteaga, who's the lead customer researcher at GoDaddy within their CX research and strategy team. And I'm super excited to have her because I am a very happy GoDaddy customer, I must say. They host all my web domains. They host my Rock and Roll Research Podcast email address. So I fully expect that maybe the next time we talk, Mireya, it'll be a one-on-one interview, or maybe I'll be a focus group participant. So I got things to say, right?
For sure.
All right. So Mireya has been in research for some time. She also owns her own LLC called Human Stories, where she's done some really good branding and strategy work for a group of blue chip customers of hers. So we know that Mireya is an excellent researcher. That's established. But what is especially interesting about her is her penchant to dive in and try new and crazy things. So I don't know, like Formula race car driving, or her latest hobby, which is playing the drums, which of course is my own personal favorite hobby. So we're going to talk about all that and more on today's podcast. Welcome to the show, Mireya.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here and to see another drummer and researcher.
Yes.
Interesting Venn diagram that we are.
It's a great combination, right?
That's the best.
All right, so let's start here. So how did you get into research in the first place? What attracted you?
Research is interesting. I have yet to hear of anyone who's a researcher that was just straight into research, knew what they wanted to do, got into research, or had a parent that was in research. It's kind of a field that it seems like everybody fell into, and that's kind of myself as well.
Sure.
So I originally had a career before research. I kind of worked for a law firm, worked for a library, much more like academic and that type of research, like literary research.
Right.
And then I started getting into data analytics and decided to go back to school. So I graduated at 30 as a parent, put myself back through school, finally got my degree, got into data analytics, and really liked the work, but I felt that it felt a little hollow to me, just kind of looking at numbers and not seeing the whole reason why people were making decision A versus decision B. So for me, moving into something that was a bit more holistic was really important. So I was hired by Paul Netto, who's, speaking of cars, who's a real racer. I'm not a real racer. I'm just like a trained amateur, but Paul Netto is actually a researcher and a real racer. He does BMWs, but he hired me for a research position, a classic research position at a company that we worked for called Yumi back in 2015. And I kind of was trial by fire and thrown into it with Paul, and he was a fantastic mentor. He made it incredibly interesting. So I worked with Paul for a bit, and then fell in love with research, went into kind of the consulting route, had my own business, which I established back then too, and was able to work with some really wonderful, interesting companies, mostly advertising agencies. Is kind of where I cut my teeth in research.
Sure.
And just recently started working for GoDaddy in the last year or so. And that's been great. That's been kind of a complete turnaround for me from working on the vendor side and kind of pitch hitting as on the client side, but now being fully immersed on the client side, really, deep diving in customer data, talking to people every day, which is something that is great. I'm like a quant person by trade, and then getting able to do interviews frequently is it's so fascinating. I just love it. So it's kind of a roundabout way of getting here, but every step for me has just been getting to know people, customers, products just more intimately and in more of a holistic fashion.
Sure. That's really interesting that you started on more of the consultant side, the supplier side, if you will. And now you're on the client side. Would love to hear a little bit more about what you're doing currently at GoDaddy, and maybe a little bit of a contrast between, sort of supplier and client side.
Yeah. It's the biggest difference I always see with being on the supplier and vendor side is typically sample is huge, right? Because we're doing like bigger market potential, bigger sampling, huge budgets, right? Especially if I come from an
Right.
advertising background, it is just ridiculous how much investment there is in these particular projects, and that makes it thrilling and exciting and fun. And you say, how about 10,000 people here, and how about 5,000 here? And there's lots of exciting things you can do. A lot of flexibility, lots of data cuts, and they're to me, those are kind of more sweeping, broad generalizations and kind of talking points, more like front of site, more like blog posts, more marketing copy, much more substance for that. Whereas
Sure.
now, working on the client side, it's much more of a like an intimate conversation with our customers. Samples are much smaller. Obviously, when we do a lot of qual work, it's like 20 and under people that we're talking to at a time.
Sure.
But having these really deep conversations is fantastic because I write surveys basically every day, right? Like I work with surveys all the time, and I really just kind of estimate what's the right thing to ask. Is this the right set of questions? Am I really getting at what the meat of their desires are, their motivations are? And then when I switch to more qual work here at GoDaddy, what I love about it is just it really I can have a hypothesis, and then immediately in the first 5 or 6 interviews, it's just completely disproven, or yes, that was right, and
Yeah.
it's given me a new language to talk to our customers as well. So I specialize in our web pros, so that's website designers and developers, who are a new category for me. I didn't really know anything about it whatsoever coming into GoDaddy, but being able to really just jump in and talk to people one-on-one for an hour at a time has just it's less of being a jack of all trades, which I feel like I was before, and now much more of a specialist. So I think that's a great opportunity for me.
Yeah, that's great. Cool. So let's talk about race car driving. So you mentioned you're a trained amateur.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I'm a trained amateur in a whole lot of things. And by the way, for hopefully the 2 people that listen to this podcast, and probably my mom, who's the one of the 2, I'm like the most risk averse person you have ever met. So these sound like very exciting, thrilling hobbies, but I work in like risk mitigation as a profession, and that's the kind of person I am. But what really drew me to that is my father, who passed away quite a while ago, but he was into Formula 4s, which are the smaller open wheel race cars. They're not Formula 1s because those are expensive and you have to be an incredible professional, but you can get into Formula racing relatively inexpensively, which is what my father did. He really just inspired kind of a love of cars for me, and more so than that, really the kind of precision that one needs to be a very consistent driver, and understanding how to navigate a racetrack and heel toe downshift. And it was all just fascinating to me. And my dad actually taught me to drive, which I tell everybody the story. This is absolutely true. Taught me to drive a manual car. And he'd say, okay, Mireya, when you're in doubt, just floor it. It doesn't matter what it is, just floor it. So that's like kind of the education I got about driving. So my dad really spurred that interest in me. I took this was a while back. It used to be called Sears Point and Infineon in the old days up here in Northern California. And it's a fabulous racetrack, world famous. We had Russell Racing School back then was what I went to. There were 2 different series. You stay over a couple days and you have like 8 hours on track and lessons, and you work with coaches. And the first class is kind of like more of an intro, lower powered formula car, and then the next class you graduated to like a higher powered car. You get your name on the side of it, which is really awesome. And you just practice it. You just drive all day. And that I was never an incredibly fast driver, but I was a very consistent driver, which I think is kind of a perfect tie-in into doing research and kind of what I am as a professional.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There seems to be maybe a little bit more in common than you might think, right? Like driving fast versus something that's maybe perceived as low risk, like research, right? But
Right.
maybe there are some commonalities. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was thinking about that just the other day when thinking about the hobbies and drums and racing and such, and um, it seems to be like a consistency thing and a precision thing that I think is very
Right.
interesting and in wonderful parallel. There's like a sense of perfection that one can never have in any hobby, but in cars for me in research, but and now in drums, it's kind of there's really a right way to do something. Well, okay, that's I shouldn't even say that as a researcher, right? But I'm always drawn by the idea that there's a perfect way to drive this car, to shift, to get this research brief together. Like if there's just an ideal and right way to do it, that is really appealing to me. That's always appealed to me in research, the kind of the exactness of it, working with a lot of nebulous data, a lot of customer thoughts, emotions, and then really putting something to it that's concrete and believable. That for me is just like the best part of research.
Yeah, yeah, I can relate to that for sure. So let's talk drums.
Yes, let's talk drums. Yeah, absolutely.
So where did that interest generate for you?
Drums for me, drums is a very, very new hobby. I know we've touched on it very briefly, but I just started about 5 months ago. I've always been a huge, huge drum fan. Ringo Starr was my first, I'm a big fan of Ringo Starr. He's my number one drummer. I have a autographed picture of his here by my drum set. I wrote him a letter when I was 10, probably like 7 or something, really, really young.
And he
Um,
responded to you?
yeah, I got a signed picture back. Yeah, this was back in
Oh, that's
the
great.
wow, this is back in the 80s. So I think there was no such thing as like an authentic autograph back then, right?
Yeah.
Too new. But yeah, so I've always been interested in drums. There's just and you're a professional drummer, but even as an amateur, just hearing the way it really carries everything. There's like a consistency again, which I really like. There's a lot of creativity, a lot of passion in it. It's been fascinating for me. And hearing just all the different things that one can accomplish in drums. I've always enjoyed listening to it. And it wasn't until this past year I thought, hey, I'd like to give that a try because it just looks like it's fun to do. And I knew it was going to be a difficult thing to do, but it is just enormously complicated. And I'm 5 months into it, so knowing enough to hold a beat is like the greatest victory.
Yeah.
But now disconnecting, I didn't realize you have to use 2 feet at once and 2 hands at once with kind of like different tempos, as you're very well versed in. That for me has just been, it's like hitting a wall. But but every little victory when I practice is just it's like being reborn. It's just I feel like a genius when something can really come together. So that's been something that's really exciting for me.
Yeah, yeah, that's the cool thing. There's just kind of an interesting dichotomy where you never get to the point where you actually feel like you're good because you
Yeah.
can always listen to someone who is so much better than you are. So you never feel like you're good, but once you cross some of those barriers and you can do something new for the first time, it's like it just sets off these endorphins, right? And it's so exciting. So it keeps you going even though you never get to the top of the mountain.
That's probably true. Although, it seems like everybody else is on top of the mountain. It feels like I'm at the bottom, but it's interesting to hear that you as a professional feel similarly, which is surprising.
Yeah, I would say, call me semi-professional, weekend warrior, weekend
Okay.
warrior. All right. So let's get back to research again for a second. So you've done a few different things in research. You've got a quantitative background and you're taking on a lot of qualitative research. What do you see as maybe emerging trends or things that are becoming important or will become important in the research space?
So what I've seen lately over the past 4 or 5 years, which I've been keeping my eye on, is the big perspective shift in terms of diversity and inclusion in research. So
Mm-hmm.
I first started thinking about this when we started having questions, writing surveys and saying, do we have more than two genders? Like, do we include it? Two, do we need it? Three, what's going to happen if we include that? Can we compare? Can we not compare with past research? Just starts with small questions like that. That was a good number of years ago. And now, on LinkedIn, I frequently see posts about people posting sessions and classes on how to have more diverse audiences and making sure our questions are much more reflective of our audiences and the way they're speaking and the types of considerations they would have or sensitivities that we should have. So that to me has been incredibly interesting. And it's just the sign of a general larger shift in the country, which I think is fascinating. So I've been watching that unfold myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's some really great resources out there now. I know Insights in Color did a really useful paper when it comes to thinking through how do we ask questions that are respectful and get what we need and are, working with the times, if you will. So there's a lot of help out there and people that are really doing a lot of good work to help us all kind of get up to speed on how we should think about that. So that's great. Cool. So this is a podcast, right? And I don't know if you listen to podcasts, but I know that you've got lots of interests, right? Clearly, some of them professional, and then all these other things that you work on. So what are some sources, media sources, podcasts or otherwise, that you turn to for information or inspiration or just enjoyment?
Just for fun. I like that. I like that enjoyment qualifier, because a lot of times when we have discussions about our careers, we say, what are you reading for, work for to better yourself as a researcher? And it's like, well, I do things for fun too, which is, I think, the most important part of our lives too. So for fun, I'm a big reader. You talk about media, so just media in general, I read all the time. I read everything. I like reading a lot of mysteries, comedies. David Sedaris is one of my favorite authors. I just saw him at a reading just about a week ago. And then as for digital media, I do listen to podcasts. I love podcasts since I'm what I like to say is professionally nosy, and I like to learn about people and their decision makings. I listen to a lot of like therapy podcasts, which is just endlessly fascinating. So I like to listen to Where Do We Begin by Esther Perel. I'm not sure if you've heard of her. That's fascinating. She'll kind of take like a couple that could be like a regular relationship or mother-daughter, any two people. She just spends a single hour with them and kind of dissects their issues, and it is just it's amazing. There's that one, and there's also one called Dear Therapist, kind of similar in that vein. Those two I think are my main podcasts, just because of the deep dive into a person's decision making process is endlessly fascinating to me.
So is it like being a fly on the wall for a therapy session? Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, and isn't that exciting? It's exactly like that. And it's funny because it's one thing to be a viewer of people's issues, and it's fascinating, it's interesting, but it's also wonderful to be able to turn it off and not have that as part of one's own life. It's like being a spectator is the fun part.
Yeah, I could see that. See how that would be interesting, and certainly kind of dovetails into research, right? So it's I can see how a researcher would be interested in that kind of content. Super cool. All right, Mireya, this is the most important question, of course, and it's the hardest question. Now I've got some guesses based on what we've talked, but I'm very, very curious. I need to know. So let's say you're stranded on a desert island. You've got 3 records of your choosing, whatever you want, to keep you company for the rest of your days. What are those 3 records?
So I'm on a desert island with like a record player.
That's right. That's right.
A record
You,
player. Okay.
you can listen to it on vinyl, right? So that's
Yeah.
the best format, of course.
Keep it from being sandy. Yeah, it is absolutely. That's such a good question. And I've really given this a lot of thought, probably more thought than I should, because there's records you can listen to every day. And then those that were just spectacular for their music. And then those when you're in a particular mood. But I narrowed it down to my top three, which I think encompasses a good range of kind of moods and feelings. So number one would be the White Album from the Beatles, because that's a wonderful, it's got so many wonderful songs. Mother Nature's Son is one of my favorites. Blackbird. There's a song called Sexy Sadie, which I named my daughter after that song, Sadie.
Oh, wow.
So that's an important one for me. And then the other two, which is, I wanted to add everybody to this list, but I actually picked two Red Hot Chili Peppers albums because they're probably my all-time, consistently, just since the early 90s has been like standout for all their albums, one of my favorites. So I picked Mother's Milk, which is fantastic, and then of course Blood Sugar Sex Magic, because how could you top that?
Your island is going to be funky and jumping.
Yeah.
By the way, just a little bit of drum gossip here, since you brought up the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Chad Smith, the drummer, he just left his Sabian cymbals endorsement after 25 years and just announced that he's joining Paiste. So a lot of people are upset about that. It's big news in the drumming world, right? So
I wish I was like a proficient enough drummer to know what the difference is between those cymbals, but I am familiar with his drumming and he's fantastic. So does that mean people just never play those again? Like, was he not happy with the sound of them, or what does that mean as a drummer?
You know what? I don't know. The only thing I can think is that Paiste probably backed up the money truck and gave him an offer he couldn't refuse.
Financial decision. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
I play Zildjian myself, but to each their own,
Absolutely. That's what I've got too. That's my first brand, and so far it seems like a good one. And I've seen a lot of drummers play that brand, so it seems like that's a good place to start.
Good choice. And I should say that I have seen her drum kit and it's really cool. So you're off to a really good start. So I love it.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
All right, Mireya, this has been a super fun chat. I'm super glad I met you. Certainly look forward to staying in touch. And that doesn't just have to be as a research participant, but if you have a list of willing customers who have opted in for research, you can feel free to add me to the list. But we'll stay in touch anyway, right? So we've got some drums to talk. So thanks so much, Mireya. Really appreciate it. Let's talk soon, and rock and roll.
Rock and roll.